And my project this year was all about collecting NFL player stats to create a final and ultimate fantasy team based on the stats of the players. And I collected 25 people's stats for each position with various numbers from rushing yards to sacks. My next slides are going to show the top few players at each position and interesting facts about them. My first position are the running backs. And my first player is Walter Payton, played with the Chicago Bears his whole career, and his nickname was Sweetness. Some of his stats were that he was number 2 on the all-time rushing yards list, number 5 on the all-time rushing touchdowns list, and number 2 on the all-time touches list, which is the time he got the ball to run. Walter Payton was often known as one of the most electrifying players of his time and of all time. He was a member of the 1985 Bears, which are widely considered one of the greatest teams of all time. And he was friends with Michael Jordan. They were really good friends. And he retired as a leading rusher until the 90s when Emmitt Smith broke his record. And my next player is Emmitt Smith, played with the Cowboys. So his stats are, he has the most rushing yards of all time, most rushing touchdowns of all time, and most touches of all time. Emmitt Smith played for a very long time. He was a member of the 90s Cowboys dynasty. And he was one of the smallest running backs. He was only 5'9", but he was really shifting. And he competed in season 3 of Dancing with the Stars and actually ended up winning. And then my next position is the field general, the quarterbacks. So my first player is Tom Brady, widely considered one of the greatest of all time, because he has the most Super Bowls of all time, including quarterbacks and teams. The most passing touchdowns of all time, and the second most passing yards of all time, which are only behind Drew Brees, but he can still break that record. And Tom Brady was taken with the 199th overall pick of the draft, which was in the 6th round out of the University of Michigan. And people would have drafted him as the first overall pick if they knew what he was going to become. The Broncos and the Giants are the only team with a winning record against Tom Brady. The Giants winning 2 Super Bowls against him, and the Broncos just overpowering them in the playoffs a lot. So then my next player is Drew Brees. He has the most passing yards of all time, the second best quarterback rating of all time, which is a formula to rate the quarterbacks playing, and he's ahead of Tom Brady and only behind Aaron Rodgers. And he has the second most passing touchdowns of all time, only behind Tom Brady. And he was the cover athlete of Madden 11, and when the Hurricane Katrina disaster hit New Orleans, he was very involved in helping the stadium that the Saints played in and just the overall welfare of New Orleans. And my next positions are the wide receivers and tight ends. My first player is Jerry Rice, who could also be considered the greatest of all time. He's the most receiving yards, the most receiving touchdowns, and the most receptions of all time. He went to a small college called Mississippi Valley State, and they renamed their stadium after him and his quarterback at the place. And he co-wrote 2 of his autobiographies. So then my next player was Randy Moss. He was one of the most electrifying players as well. He has the most yards per catch, the most receiving touchdowns, and the second most receiving touchdowns, and the 4th most receiving yards. He got a verb, basically, called the moss. It's where you catch it over someone. So when people tell you got moss, that's what it means, and it comes from Randy Moss. And then the tight end on this list is just Tony Gonzalez. He was on the Falcons and the Chiefs. He is the most receiving yards by a tight end, the most receptions by a tight end, and he's also on the 3rd on the all-time list, including receivers and running backs. He has the 2nd most receiving touchdowns by a tight end, and that's only behind Antonio Gates. He wears size 16 shoes, and he is the Kansas City Chiefs' all-time leading receiver. And my next position are the offensive linemen. The offensive linemen had no stats recorded. They had no like sacks allowed or QB pressures or anything. These are just the 4 best offensive linemen according to popular opinion and experts' opinion, which are Anthony Munoz. He played left tackle. He had 12 seasons with the Bengals. He was a former first-round pick. Joe Thomas, left tackle. He played 10 years with the Browns. Just retired a few years ago. And Bruce Matthews, who played center and guard. He spent his entire 19 years with the Houston/Tennessee Oilers when they moved to Tennessee. And then Larry Allen, who's a guard. He played 13 years with the Cowboys during the 90s dynasty, and he eventually went to the 49ers. And then my next position are the safeties. My first player is Paul Krause, who might not be the most well-known person on this list, but he has the record for the most interceptions of all time with 81. He's the 3rd most interception yards of all time, which is the yards after you get the interception. He spent 12 years with his entire 12 years with the Vikings. And at one point, he was traded for a 7th-round pick, which doesn't make much sense because he was the most interceptions of all time. And he got an interception in 7 straight games. My next player is Brian Dawkins, nicknamed Weapon X. He is the most forced fumbles by a safety, the 5th most tackles by a safety, and the 2nd most sacks by a safety. He has multiple nicknames such as Weapon X and B-Doc, and he was 16-8 against the Cowboys dynasty in the 90s, which was arguably one of the greatest dynasties of all time, and Brian Dawkins just changed that for him. And my next position is the cornerbacks. My first player is Rod Woodson, who may not be considered the greatest of all time, but the stats don't lie. He is the all-time leader in interceptions for cornerbacks, the leader in interception yards for cornerbacks, and the leader in defensive touchdowns for cornerbacks. He also was a very dynamic kick returner. He had 4,894 kickoff return yards, and he was also a track athlete at Purdue University. So he was a very athletic corner. The next player, one of the most well-known players of all time, Deion Sanders. He has the 2nd most interception yards with 1,331. He has 22.7 yards per kick return, which is insane, because he played kick returner with the Cowboys and the 49ers and the Ravens. And he also has 3,523 kick return total yards. But he was known for his athleticism. He ran a 4.27 second 40-yard dash, and he played in both a World Series and a Super Bowl, and also hit a home run and scored a touchdown in the same week. He played for the Atlanta Braves at the same time. And my next position are the linebackers. My first player is Lawrence Taylor, who could also be considered the greatest defensive player of all time. He has 132.5 sacks in his career and 1,088 tackles. His stats may be a lot better if they recorded the same amount of stats as they do during his time, but he was one of the best players. He was the 2nd defensive player to win the MVP, and he won 2 Super Bowls with the Giants. And my next player is Ray Lewis, played with the Baltimore Ravens his whole career. He has the 2nd most interceptions for a linebacker. He is considered one of the hardest hitting linebackers of all time. And he has 1,568 tackles during his career. And he has a street named after him in Baltimore, Maryland. It's called Number 52 Avenue, which was the number he wore. And he was also convicted of murder, but he was not sent to prison for it. And next position, the defensive lineman. My first player is Bruce Smith, who has the record for the most sacks of all time with 200 flat. He's the most solo tackles and also combined tackles by a defensive lineman. He leads in many stats for the position. He was the 1st overall pick in the draft, and he just got inducted into the Hall of Fame 11 years ago. My second defensive lineman is named Reggie White. His nickname is the Minister of Defense because he was an evangelical Christian minister during his time, which gave him his nickname. And he is the second most sacks of all time, the second most combined and solo tackles for defensive linemen, and he has 33 forced fumbles in his career. He was also the best paid defensive player of all time during his career, which was the 90s. So players weren't paid as much as they are right now. Our next players, kickers and punters. My first player is Justin Tucker, who is still playing in the NFL right now. He just got into the league 7 years ago. And he has the best field goal percentage of all time right now, 6% higher than anyone else with 90. He's never missed a field goal from 20 to 29 yards, and he's only missed 3 field goals from 30 to 39 yards. So he's one of the most accurate kickers of all time. He is the highest paid kicker in NFL history, which makes sense considering he's never missed a 20 to 29 yard field goal. And he can sing in 7 different languages. The last player is a punter. His name is Shane LECHLER. He has the most yards per punt in NFL history with 46. He's the most total punt yardage in NFL history with 66,000. And he has punted the most times in NFL history. He made 7 Pro Bowls during his long career, and he was on the 2000s All-Decade team. So in conclusion, I had a lot of fun researching every player's statistics. It was very interesting to research some of the players that many have not ever heard of, but it was very compelling to see all the different stats that people have amounted to in their careers. Thank you for watching.